This game is Chronicles of Skin, which I have in its original physical uh, publication, which is actually a little booklet, kind of a little guy. And it came with one sheet, which is called the Skin, specifically for the version of play called the Sketch. So that's this. Actually, it's two-sided. The other side is the version that's not the Sketch. I also have the PDF, so I'm able to just print out my own copies rather than drawing on their cool one, right? So I'll refer to these during the talk. It also is primarily composed of a fairly variegated set of cards, including a whole bunch of character cards, which are divided into two cultures called the Crowan and the EO. So there's the Crowan, there's the EO, and the characters are fairly sketchy, but give you some game mechanics and a couple of orienters on each one. And then you have a lot of other cards. Significantly, you have these things which are covered with little symbols. There's 4 per card, and so there's a ton of those. So there's tons of these symbols of various things that are called aspects, beliefs, and rules, and unity. Okay, lots of other cards too. So anyway, I will continue, as we go. So the way the game is played is you're all sitting around together, and there are 2 versions. One's called the Sketch, which is a fairly abbreviated or limited form of play. At least this is the theory. And then the other, which is called the Chronicle, which is, you might think of it, they say the more, once you're experienced, you've tried the Sketch, then get back and do, the Chronicle, which is more open-ended in some ways, and certainly more flexible in its content. So I'm not sure if I really want to explain the whole thing like a tutorial. That's not really what I want to do. But one of the clear purposes of the game is to teach role-playing to people who have never done it, but without using any hobby terms or assumptions. So you've got a ton of stuff in there, which I would simply identify as things we're familiar with from role-playing, but they have different names and they're presented in different ways or relationships to one another than the role-playing hobby is accustomed to doing it. Now, I know this very well because this is exactly what I went through with Shpione and Shahida, where the very notion, I don't even use the word like play my character and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that people are ordinarily doing. And what I found is when you introduce a game like this to role players, because they're not receiving the information or the roles and activities the way they're used to, they think it must be exotic and they start doing something else, whatever it is. Well, anyway, I would like to play this sometime with people who have no idea anything about role-playing, just to see kind of what they do, how they engage with that material. So, with role players, which is far more likely, I suspect that we'd have a lot of sort of orienting as we go to say this is or isn't like what you may think or something like that. And that becomes tedious. So hopefully we could avoid that if we play. Like a lot of games that came out after 2000 or so, the authors put a lot of work into shared physical activity at the table. And so in these days of distancing, that makes life a little harder to actually play. If we played this, we would actually have to do things like screenshots, or take a pic and then share the picture, and then everybody would get the picture and maybe even have to print it in order to work with the next step. So it might be a little bit laborious. On the other hand, I kind of like I've tried Chronicles of Skin a little bit. We didn't do a whole sketch, let alone the Chronicles, so it's kind of like I poked at it a little bit. I cannot properly be said to have played it. So That means that I think a measured approach, the one thing I've taken with me from that was that it's not really something you want to rush. You don't want to just shove tokens around the table and shout, I do this. And the other one says, I oppose, and then, do the little routine and then, jump along. I mean, it's there to be played in the very same way as you would really want to chew into play with a character you really liked and a game master who's really good at like setting up, framing the situation, and then everybody doing stuff in it. And you have mechanisms to handle what it is that people want to do. And if you say, well, I like doing that, well, then you should like doing it with a game like this too. So anyways, here we go. In the sketch, you have these fixed, kind of these fixed things on the skin sheet. Okay, so first of all, you've got your Crowan and your EO, who are very well defined. They've got this complicated sigil, and they've each got their little glyph, and they've each got an aspect and a belief and a rule that they follow, and they've got the unity, which is something that both cultures share. These are very brief phrases, and they will be interpreted by that particular group in play, but in this sketch version, they're fixed. They're handed to you on the sheet. And then down here in this thing that's kind of like a map, you've got names of places. There's 3 of them. And like the slave towers of Chikugo. And then, somebody talented has drawn little sketches that go with them, which is fine. And so you've got other things all over the sheet. You've got things like the tragedy pile and all sorts of stuff like that. Each player draws a character. You also draw these things called the theme cards, a couple of those, and you draw this thing called the Glyph of War. And there's this method for moving into narration. Somebody's going to start the scribe is going to pick the location and read a little sort of fixed text, and then everybody's going to sort of start saying what they see or do. Now, in the sketch, you have your character in front of you, but you actually don't direct anything they do. Your character does things when someone else says they do, and there's this thing called the puppet action. Somebody picks up the puppet action, and has your character do something. There's a somewhat elaborate little scheme for if you don't want your character to do it, then there's this token runoff by which a bunch of tokens go into the tragedy pile, and the character either does what the puppeteer says or they do what you say. So that occurs, and then there are these action event cards too. So, if you want something to happen that changes the situation in some way, then you grab the event card and make that go. So these are both called action cards, and so these action cards are basically how role-playing and the continuation of phenomena occur in that scene. So you have 3 units of this, and each unit is made of each person getting 2 turns. So within one of these chapters, I guess, then you have, you go around so that everybody gets 2 turns, and all these things have happened, and characters might have died, or, we've sort of seen some stuff play out. You do this 3 times, as I say, and this is the beginning and the middle and the end of the war between the Crowan and the EO, which will result in the destruction of one of the cultures. The scribbling on the sheet is a big deal, and the pile up of corpses to all the tokens that have gone into the tragedy pile turn into corpses. There's at one point where the scribe states, some dreadful thing that has happened to one side or the other. And then so the corpse pile suddenly piles up, on the victimized side. And it's fairly rigid in this sort of structure. What you have control over are your characterizations and who does what to whom and what a given character may be like. right? So it's the discovery of the character and of their consequences to the immediate situation. The scribe coming up with that atrocity or tragedy for that phase of the war seems to me like a really big deal, in that it needs to be arising directly out of what has happened based on what all these characters have done. So, or events that have occurred, that some player has said. All right. Well, it ends with each little set, the beginning and the middle and the end, ends with the scribe assigning which player knocked it out of the park per theme. They get extra tokens for the next time. A lot of characters might be dead, or the ones that have survived go over to the survivor pile. One thing that's interesting, you can use an event card to formally bring in a new character during play. So you may be adding more characters in front of you that are technically yours. Did I get that right? Actually, I think those characters aren't owned, but you still puppet them, to do stuff with them just as regular. But those characters can become surviving characters too. Repeating characters into the next chapter is favored. It's not required, and you end up with basically a story of a war, and there's a means at the end to determine which of the two cultures is, I guess you could say, triumphant, because this is where things get interesting, squicky, but perhaps powerful, in that what you then do is create, and there's a formal mechanism for it, depending on how tokens that people have put in and the way that the vote has gone and stuff like that. There is a mechanism by which you end up with the historical account of the war. And it doesn't really have to match what actually happened or correspond directly. It doesn't have to be wrong either, or maybe about things that we didn't actually see in play. Who knows? But include claims that we didn't see in play. But the point is that you're looking at it, and it's quite a triumphalist little story of sort of like the failings of this people and how this feature of the victorious people went on to, make the world a better place or something. And so it's kind of at first it's taken at face value. It's quite squicky. It's like, wait, so you win a war and you're the good guys. What is that? But then you kind of look at it more like, well, this is kind of a critique of that, and it's the story that we did. It's the stuff we did at the table that we think of, we know, right? And that's kind of cool. The Chronicle version has a couple of interesting tweaks. The straightforward ones are really easy, that you're starting with blank sheets rather than these fixed cultures. They're still called the Crowan and the Eo, but you actually come up with their aspects and beliefs and stuff like that, and their new symbols and things yourselves. You do it through the card draws, and then somebody sketches out like the new sigil and stuff like that based on the components that the cards provide. You can also go back to the ones that you saw for the sketch and realize that all those elaborate symbols and things are an example from exactly the same process. Well, anyway, you do that, and so you end up with these unique cultures, basically a new setting, just using, the same names for convenience. And you have these two weird cultures, they're going to be at odds. Instead of having these named locations on the map, those are created by the new scribe for each chapter. I should mention that every chapter gets a new scribe. And so the locations are kind of built, as we go along. And the way play occurs is slightly different. Every player gets their own theme card, rather than there being two theme cards that we're all kind of according with or defying or addressing in some way. And you also have a little more flexibility, like somebody could put out, you get your character card and you say, well, I don't like it. You've got tokens, so you spend a token and trade it back. Or perhaps you don't like the Glyph of War card. You think you can spend a token and trade it out. You can't do that during play. It's all during prep. Well, so there's all this much more flexibility about setting it all up, which is fine. But that's not really the biggest difference. The biggest difference comes because in the Chronicle play, you can play your character as free play. Actions your character takes, you don't have to like take the action card for. You don't have to. You just, your own character is played like your player character, but you still have the puppeting and you still have the events. So people can still take those cards and like puppet a character. Also, if a new character gets invented through an event card, you have to puppet it to play it. So it's, in this case, I mean, before, when it was the only way your character got to do anything was when someone else said they did, and then you either just agreed or you said no, they do something else, and battled, duke it out over whose way goes. Here you have that occurring, but also in this larger, thicker sea of more free play about what they're doing according to their actual players. So that's occurring. And there's a much more, there are 4 locations, not 3. There's a more elaborate method of coming up with certain consequential events, at the end and stuff like that. One thing that I find really, I'm not sure about this. In the sketch, the scribe picks for each theme card, because there are just those 2 sitting out. For each theme card, the scribe says, Bob, you were great with that theme. With you here, that theme just popped in play. So here, get your token reward. So they ends up with a few more tokens than everyone else. And you do that for both cards. Interestingly enough, they could be for the same person, if that person was like the shining light of theme play or something. But that's what happens, scribe says. Then in the other, in the Chronicle, you have a more elaborate situation because each person had their own theme card. Now you have this vote for who basically was best. Who was the theme player with their respective themes. There's a blind vote. You vote with your eyes closed and stuff like that. You can't vote for yourself. And then that person, gets it. So it's a little strange. A lot of people, me included, have shied away from the whole who did best and here's your reward. Very, very common in experience point systems to say, the person who role played the best or the most, gets an extra benefit. In my experience, such practices just fall out of play. We just don't do them. It could be there in the rules. This is part of the experience point system. Usually there's kind of an optional next to them, not always. And I just always just say, oh, well, I opt not to do it. And nobody seems to beg for it. I've never seen a player say, incidentally, so-and-so or myself, whoever, was a great role player, so they need to get that extra point, or they get those extra 100 points, or however the experience system works. I've never seen anyone do that. It's never been validated at the table as a desirable feature. Now, so I can't necessarily say bad design. Don't have that. I can't really say that. But observationally and emotionally, and unfortunately those are linked, right? Maybe it's self-selecting. I play with people who wouldn't do it, and who knows. So that level of critical judgment I don't have, but it is a part of play, and the text even nods to the idea that the Chronicle is a little more competitive because it's kind of assuming that you're driving for more tokens. Kind of a tricky notion. You play so that you'll have more power in play to get your way, right? That particular principle is very broken. That is where I say, is that what's going on? But that might not be what's going on. Maybe it just ends up being a fun way to appreciate one another. Maybe it's okay. Maybe the way that it plays leads people, to enjoy the thematic stuff. You go, wow, that was great. That guy, that was awesome. And it's just it's basically a big, a thumbs up, like giving someone fan mail. Who knows? Maybe so. Well, anyway, it's a fairly colorful, very engaging game in terms of its symbolism. You're sketching on the paper, making a unique pictographic record. It's kind of grim enough. I mean, the war is not presented in sort of a joyful way. It's not, this war is cool. We're going to play out this war. No, it's more like this is a tragedy. This is a grim, grim thing that happened in the history of the setting, and this is the story that people tell afterward. So there's some resonance there, I think. And everything is so exotic and fantastified that you don't really have sort of the squeaky element of saying, oh boy, let's play Spaniards versus Aztecs. That'll be awesome. Doesn't really strike me as awesome. And the game doesn't really have that sensibility to it at all. So I think it may actually have some... I think it has some weight that I'd like to check out. Again, without forcing it, playing the characters and seeing what they do as the march of history, marches on them. So that's it. Chronicles of Skin. With a little effort, I mean, the PDF is free, freely available, and with a little tiny bit of effort, I think it could be handled with screen-based play. Perhaps a valuable effort to kind of keep things nice and slow and relaxed. So let me know. I mean, this is something that I kind of delved into after the game was published in 2012, and we just didn't really do much more of it. And I thought to myself, I need to get back to this one of these days.